Ireland, 1872. Part 1. The Unspoken World. The village of Cork, nestled in the verdant hills of southern Ireland, lay bathed in the soft, golden light of a late summer afternoon. The cottages, built from sturdy stone and thatched with straw, stood like silent witnesses to the lives they housed. Smoke from hearths curled gently toward the sky, carrying with it the scent of burning peat, while the voices of villagers floated through the air. Greetings exchanged, laughter shared, prayers whispered. Amidst the everyday rhythm of this small, devout community was the O'Rourke cottage. Unlike the others, this home held a unique stillness. Inside, Connor sat at the edge of a small, worn wooden table, his hands clasped in quiet thought. His deep brown eyes, which seemed to carry the wisdom of one much older, gazed out the small window that framed the green hills beyond. Though his lips were motionless, his mind was alive, always observing, always feeling. Connor had never known sound the way others did. The world was a place of vibrant movement, but also eerie silence for him. He watched people's lips move, studied their expressions, read their gestures, but for him, it was all muted. The birds in the trees sang their songs, the wind rustled through the grass, and the sea roared against the distant cliffs. But these melodies were lost on Connor. His world had always been one of silence. Eamon and Siobhan O'Rourke, his parents, were simple folk. Eamon was a tall man with broad shoulders and calloused hands, the result of years working the land and caring for their flock of sheep. Siobhan, graceful yet weathered by the hardships of life, spent her days tending to the home, her quiet strength carrying the family through every challenge they faced. They were deeply religious, their faith intertwined with every part of their existence. For as long as Connor could remember, they had prayed for him, prayed for a miracle that would unlock his voice. Their prayers had become a daily ritual, their hope unyielding. Despite his silence, Connor's presence was strong. He communicated not with words, but through actions. He was the first to rise at dawn to help Eamon with the animals and the last to rest, often sitting by the hearth late into the night, listening to the crackle of the fire through the movements of the flames. The boy had a natural way of comforting others. He listened with his whole being, and though he did not speak, those around him often felt heard in ways that words could never convey. He had an innate understanding of human emotion, as though the absence of one sense had heightened another. The village, small and close-knit, had long accepted Connor's condition. Children ran to him in the streets, eager for his attention, pulling at his sleeves, and he would smile, kneel down, and silently guide them in their play. The older villagers admired him for his work ethic and the way he carried himself, never resentful of his muteness, never burdening anyone with complaints. His silence, they believed, was part of what made him special. Still, the whispers around Cork never ceased. Will God ever answer the prayers of the O'Rourkes? Inside their humble home, the atmosphere was one of faith, but also of longing. Each evening after supper, Eamon and Siobhan would kneel by the hearth, their hands clasped tightly together, heads bowed, offering the same prayer they had whispered for years. The flickering firelight cast dancing shadows across the walls as they prayed aloud, asking God to give their son the gift of speech. Connor, sitting in his favorite chair by the window, would watch them, feeling both the depth of their love and the weight of their sadness. For Connor, his silence was not a curse, but neither was it easy. He had learned to live within it, finding solace in the natural world that surrounded him. He could often be found wandering the fields at dawn, watching the sun rise over the misty hills, the landscape bathed in golden hues. It was in these moments, with the wind brushing against his face and the earth solid beneath his feet, that Connor felt closest to God. Though he could not speak his prayers, he offered them silently, trusting that God could hear his heart. His connection to the divine was a quiet one, an unspoken relationship built on observation and faith. Every Sunday, Connor would accompany his family to St. Michael's Church, where the villagers gathered for Mass. He never missed a service, though he could not join in the hymns or the communal prayers. Instead, he stood beside his parents, his head bowed in reverence, his eyes closed, absorbing the spiritual energy that filled the small stone church. The church itself was a place of refuge for Connor, its walls echoing with prayers from generations past. The stained glass windows, depicting saints and scenes from Scripture, cast vibrant patches of color across the stone floor. Connor often sat in the back, watching as Father Patrick, the village priest, led the congregation in prayer. The reverence in the air, the flickering of candles, the gentle murmur of voices. It was here that Connor felt most at peace, even if he could not participate in the same way as others. Yet, despite his contentment, there was a longing deep within him that he could not shake. A desire not just to hear, but to speak, to tell his parents that he loved them, to pray aloud to God, to say the words he had only ever thought. But Connor had come to accept that this might never be his reality. He had lived his life in silence, and he believed that perhaps God had a different plan for him, one that didn't require a voice. One late summer evening, as the sun began to set behind the hills, casting the sky in hues of pink and orange, Eamon and Siobhan gathered by the hearth for their nightly prayer. Connor sat nearby, watching the flames dance. His mother's voice, soft yet resolute, echoed through the small room as she prayed for their son's miracle. Eamon, though a man of few words, added his own prayer, his voice deep and steady. Connor watched them, a pang of sadness settling in his chest. He wanted to speak for them, if not for himself. He wanted to answer their prayers, to end the years of waiting. He wanted, more than anything, to give them the joy they had so faithfully hoped for. But all he could offer was silence. As the prayer ended, Siobhan rose and approached her son. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with love and unwavering belief. "One day, Connor," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "God will hear us." Connor looked up at her and nodded, a small, reassuring smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that a miracle was possible. But deep down, he wondered if perhaps his role in this world was not to speak, but to be silent, to listen, to observe, to feel the world in ways others could not. And yet, in the quiet moments before sleep, as the village settled into its peaceful night, Connor's heart would whisper its own prayer. A prayer for understanding, a prayer for peace, a prayer for the voice he had never known. The days passed, and life in Cork continued as it always had, but a quiet anticipation began to build. The announcement of a special church celebration in honor of Jesus Christ stirred something within the community, a sense of hope that had long been dormant. And for the O'Rourke family, it was a glimmer of possibility, a moment where heaven might finally meet earth. But for Connor, the silent boy who had known only observation and stillness, this approaching celebration felt different. Something was changing, though he could not say what. He simply watched and waited, his heart full of the unspoken words he had carried all his life. Part 2. The Weight of Silent Prayers. The Church of St. Michael stood at the heart of Cork like a silent sentinel, its weathered stone walls thick with the weight of centuries of prayer. The small building had stood for as long as the villagers could remember, its towering steeple pointing toward the heavens as if to guide their prayers to God. The inside of the church was a haven of peace, a place where the worries of the world seemed to fade away in the flickering glow of candlelight, where the stained glass windows told stories of saints and salvation, casting vibrant pools of light that danced across the stone floor. For the people of Cork, Sunday was not just a day of worship. It was the center of their lives, a time when the entire village gathered as one, their voices raised in song and prayer. And yet, among all these voices, one was always missing: Connor's. As the sun rose on another Sunday morning, Connor walked alongside his parents towards St. Michael's. The early morning mist clung to the hills, and the familiar sound of bells echoed through the air, calling the villagers to gather. Eamon and Siobhan walked in quiet conversation, but Connor, as always, remained silent, his steps measured, his thoughts elsewhere. The road leading to the church was a familiar one, its twists and turns etched in his memory from years of walking this path. But today, something felt different. It was a feeling that settled deep in his chest, a quiet anticipation that he couldn't explain. Inside the church, the air was thick with reverence. Villagers greeted each other with smiles and warm embraces before taking their seats in the wooden pews, the creaking of the old wood blending with the murmurs of hushed conversation. Connor sat with his parents near the front, as they always did, their hands clasped in prayer as Father Patrick prepared to begin the service. The priest, a kind man with gentle eyes and a voice that carried like a soothing lullaby, had been a part of Connor's life for as long as he could remember. Father Patrick had baptized him, counseled his family, and offered countless prayers for him over the years. Today's service, however, had a special significance. As Father Patrick approached the altar, the soft rustling of robes signaled the start of the Mass. His voice echoed through the church, each word carefully chosen, each prayer laced with devotion. Connor watched him, his eyes tracing the priest's movements, his heart attuned to the sacred atmosphere that filled the space. He had always been a keen observer of the world around him, but here, in the church, his observations took on a deeper meaning. Every gesture, every word, seemed to carry a weight that he could feel, even in his silence. The familiar rhythm of the service continued, but today, there was a heightened sense of anticipation in the air. As the villagers bowed their heads in prayer, Father Patrick paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the congregation, before delivering an announcement that sent a ripple of excitement through the pews. "In 2 weeks' time," he began, his voice full of solemnity, "we will gather here for a special celebration in honor of our Lord Jesus Christ. It will be a day of prayer, reflection, and blessings, a time for us to come together as a community and offer our thanks for His grace." The announcement, though simple, carried with it a sense of hope that was palpable. For the villagers of Cork, whose lives were built on faith, this celebration was more than just an event. It was an opportunity for miracles. And for Eamon and Siobhan, it was a chance to renew their prayers for their son. Siobhan's eyes, always soft with motherly warmth, brightened with hope as she exchanged a glance with Eamon. Though they spoke no words, their hearts shared the same prayer, that this would be the moment when God finally answered their plea. Connor noticed the shift in their demeanor, the quiet excitement that flickered beneath their composed exterior. He didn't need words to understand their thoughts. They wore their hopes like a second skin, and he felt it as deeply as they did. As the service continued, the villagers offered their prayers, the murmured words blending together into a quiet hum that filled the church. Connor remained silent, as he always did, but his mind was racing. The thought of the upcoming celebration stirred something within him, something he couldn't quite grasp. He had grown accustomed to his parents' hopes and prayers, had accepted that their faith would never waver, even in the face of years of silence. But today, as he sat in the familiar pews of St. Michael's, watching Father Patrick prepare the congregation for what was to come, Connor felt a shift, a pull towards something beyond his understanding. The idea of a miracle had always been present in his life, woven into the fabric of his existence. His parents believed in it with every fiber of their being, and though Connor had never doubted their faith, he had never truly allowed himself to hope for such a thing. He had lived his life in silence for so long that it had become a part of him, something he had come to terms with. But now, with the promise of the celebration hanging in the air, that familiar silence felt less like a constant and more like a question, one that hung unanswered in the space between his heart and his voice. As the service drew to a close, Father Patrick's voice rose in a final prayer, blessing the congregation before they rose to leave. The villagers filed out of the church, their faces alight with anticipation for the coming weeks. Connor followed his parents out into the bright sunlight, the cool air a welcome contrast to the warmth inside the church. As they walked down the steps and back onto the path toward home, Siobhan reached for Connor's hand, squeezing it gently. "This celebration," she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction, "will be a special one, Connor. I can feel it." Connor looked at her, his eyes filled with the quiet understanding that had always defined their relationship. He didn't need to speak for her to know what he was thinking. She smiled, her faith unwavering, and they continued their walk home in comfortable silence. Over the next few days, the village buzzed with preparations for the upcoming celebration. Banners were hung, flowers were gathered, and every household seemed to be preparing for what they hoped would be a day of miracles. For the O'Rourkes, the days leading up to the event were filled with prayer and quiet hope. Eamon spent his evenings tending to the animals, his mind filled with thoughts of the coming celebration, while Siobhan lit candles each night, offering prayers for her son's voice. Connor, as always, watched and waited. He had long since learned that patience was his greatest ally. Patience in the face of silence. Patience in the face of unanswered prayers. But now, as the village prepared for the celebration, he found himself filled with a quiet sense of expectancy, as though something was shifting in the very air around him. And as the day of the celebration drew closer, the weight of silent prayers hung heavy over the village, each one carrying the hopes of those who believed in the possibility of miracles. Connor, though still mute, felt a stirring in his heart, something deep, something unspoken. It was as if the quiet world he had always known was beginning to change, as if the prayers that had been whispered for so long were finally ready to be answered. He didn't know what would happen at the celebration, but for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of the impossible. And as the sun set on the eve of the celebration, casting the village of Cork in a soft, golden glow, Connor sat by his window, watching the world with the same quiet intensity that had always defined him. But tonight, there was something different in the air, something that whispered of change, of miracles, of a voice long silenced, waiting to be heard. Part 3. The Dawn of a Miracle. The day of the celebration arrived with a sky painted in hues of gold and silver, as though the heavens themselves had prepared for what was to come. The village of Cork was alive with anticipation. Every cobblestone seemed to hum with the prayers and hopes that had been whispered for weeks. Banners swayed in the gentle breeze, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray stone buildings that had weathered countless storms and prayers. The air carried a sense of expectancy, thick with the hope that today, something extraordinary would happen. In the courtyard of St. Michael's, villagers gathered in their finest clothes, the atmosphere a blend of reverence and joy. Mothers held their children close, men stood with heads bowed, and the elderly sat quietly on benches, their faces lined with years of faith and devotion. The air was filled with the scent of freshly baked bread and flowers, offerings for the celebration, as the villagers whispered among themselves, exchanging quiet glances and nods of encouragement. Everyone felt it. Today would be different. Connor stood with his parents near the front of the courtyard, his eyes scanning the familiar scene before him. His heart pounded in his chest, a steady rhythm that echoed the heightened sense of anticipation around him. He had always felt at peace in the presence of the church, its stone walls a silent witness to his years of quiet prayer. But today, there was something more, something he couldn't name, something that stirred deep within him. Father Patrick stood at the center of the courtyard, his hands raised in a gesture of blessing, his voice strong yet gentle as he led the congregation in prayer. His words flowed like water, each one resonating with the hearts of those gathered. Connor watched him, his eyes following every movement, his heart in sync with the rhythm of the service. The priest's voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of excitement in his tone, a sense that even he, a man of great faith, was expecting the miraculous. As the prayers continued, the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the courtyard. The light filtered through the trees, dappling the ground in patterns of gold and shadow, as if nature itself was joining in the celebration. Birds chirped softly in the distance, their songs mingling with the soft hum of prayer. It was a scene of perfect tranquility, yet there was an electric charge in the air, a sense that something monumental was about to unfold. Father Patrick's voice rang out once more, calling the villagers to come forward to receive the special blessing he had prepared. One by one, the people of Cork stepped forward, their heads bowed as the priest placed his hands upon them, offering a prayer of gratitude and hope. The murmurs of the congregation quieted as each person approached, a reverent hush settling over the courtyard as the blessings continued. When it was Connor's turn, his heart raced with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. He had received blessings before, many times in fact, but today felt different. There was an intensity in the air, a sense that this moment was pivotal, though he couldn't quite understand why. His parents, standing beside him, looked at him with eyes full of hope and quiet desperation. Siobhan squeezed his hand gently, her touch both a comfort and a reminder of the prayers they had carried for so long. Connor stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. His feet felt heavy, as if the weight of the years of silence had gathered in this one moment. As he approached Father Patrick, the priest's eyes softened and a small, knowing smile crossed his face. There was no need for words between them. Father Patrick had watched Connor grow up, had prayed for him countless times, had witnessed the quiet strength that defined the boy. But today, there was something more in his gaze, a deep, unspoken understanding that perhaps, just perhaps, this was the moment they had all been waiting for. Father Patrick placed his hands gently on Connor's shoulders, his touch light but firm, and began to pray. The words were familiar, but today they felt infused with a new energy, a power that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the earthly realm. The priest's voice, though steady, seemed to reverberate with a force that Connor had never felt before. It was as if the very air around them had shifted, thickening with a presence that could only be described as divine. As the prayer continued, Connor closed his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt the warmth of Father Patrick's hands, but more than that, he felt a heat rising from deep within himself. It started in his chest, a gentle warmth that slowly spread through his body, filling every inch of him with a sensation that was both foreign and familiar. His hands trembled slightly, and he clenched them into fists, trying to steady himself. But the warmth continued to build, radiating outwards until it felt like his entire being was glowing from within. The world around him seemed to fade. The sounds of the courtyard, the murmurs of prayer, even the touch of Father Patrick's hands, they all fell away, leaving only the warmth, the light, and the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. Connor felt as though he were suspended in time, caught between the earthly and the divine, his mind swimming with the intensity of it all. He wanted to open his eyes, to see if anyone else felt what he was feeling, but he couldn't. He was rooted to the spot, overwhelmed by the sensation coursing through him. And then it happened. A voice, his voice, rose from deep within him, soft at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. It was a sound he had never known, yet it felt as though it had always been a part of him, waiting for this very moment to be released. The words formed slowly, carefully, as if each one was being placed in his mouth by a hand far greater than his own. "Lord, hear my prayer." The words were clear, each one ringing out with a strength that surprised even him. His voice, which had been silent for so long, filled the air, carrying with it the weight of years of unspoken prayers, of hopes that had never been voiced. His lips moved without thought, the words flowing like a river that had been dammed for far too long, now free to rush forth with a force that could not be stopped. The courtyard fell silent, every eye turning toward Connor, every breath held in stunned disbelief. Siobhan gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Eamon stood frozen, his face a mixture of awe and overwhelming emotion. The villagers, too, were caught in the moment, their hearts racing as they witnessed the impossible. Connor continued to speak, his voice growing stronger with each word, his prayer rising to the heavens as though it had been waiting for this moment all his life. The words came effortlessly, flowing from a place deep within him that he had never known existed. It was as if the silence that had defined him was being unraveled, replaced by a voice that was not only his own, but something far greater. "Lord, I am your servant. Let your will be done." His voice carried through the courtyard, echoing off the stone walls, filling the space with a power that could only be described as divine. The villagers watched in awe, their hearts swelling with emotion, their hands trembling with the weight of the miracle unfolding before their eyes. Father Patrick, too, was overcome with emotion. His hands, still resting on Connor's shoulders, trembled as he whispered a prayer of gratitude, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. This was a moment he had prayed for, hoped for, and now, standing here, witnessing it with his own eyes, he could hardly believe it. Connor's prayer came to a gentle close, his voice softening as the final words left his lips. The courtyard remained still, the weight of the miracle hanging in the air like a sacred promise fulfilled. Slowly, hesitantly, Connor opened his eyes, his breath shallow, his body trembling from the intensity of what had just happened. He looked around, his gaze meeting the wide-eyed stares of the villagers, his parents, Father Patrick. For a moment, he wasn't sure what to do, how to feel. The world seemed both the same and completely different, as though everything had changed in an instant. And then, the realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave. He had spoken. For the first time in his life, he had spoken. Part 4. The Awakening of a Voice. The days following the miraculous event at St. Michael's were a whirlwind of disbelief, awe, and joy. The story of Connor's voice, how it had risen in prayer before the entire village, spread like wildfire through Cork and beyond. Neighbors came from nearby villages to hear the tale firsthand, their faces alight with curiosity and wonder. Some brought gifts. Others came simply to sit in silence with the O'Rourke family, offering prayers of gratitude and wiping away tears of joy. The O'Rourke cottage, once a quiet refuge, now bustled with visitors. The fire in the hearth crackled warmly, its glow casting shadows on the stone walls, while the air was thick with the scent of bread baking in the oven. Siobhan, though overwhelmed with emotion, graciously welcomed each visitor, her heart still grappling with the enormity of what had happened. She moved about the house in a daze, preparing food and tea, her hands steady but her mind whirling with the knowledge that her son's silence had been broken. Eamon, normally a man of few words, sat by the window, his eyes gazing out at the fields, though his thoughts were far away. The stoic exterior he had always maintained was shattered by the miracle he had witnessed. His heart, long weighed down by the silent prayers of years, now felt light, as if a great burden had been lifted. He hadn't cried in years, not since his own father's passing, but the sight of Connor's voice filling the air had broken something open in him. He had wept openly in the church courtyard, and even now, days later, his eyes misted over at the memory. As for Connor, his world had been irrevocably altered. The quiet existence he had known for 17 years was gone, replaced by the sound of his own voice, something he had never imagined experiencing. He had always been an observer, someone who listened, who watched, who felt deeply but never spoke. Now, the floodgates had opened, and words, beautiful, powerful words, flowed freely from his lips. But it was not just the act of speaking that amazed him. It was the nature of the words themselves. They seemed to come from a place deep within him, as if they had been waiting all his life to be released. When he spoke, it wasn't just him. It felt as though something far greater was moving through him, guiding his thoughts, shaping his speech. His voice, though unfamiliar to his ears, was filled with a wisdom that surprised even him. On the morning after the miracle, Connor sat at the kitchen table, his hands resting on the worn wood surface, his mind still reeling from the events of the previous day. Siobhan hovered nearby, her eyes never leaving him, as if she feared that at any moment the miracle would vanish, and her son's voice would once again be lost. But Connor's silence was gone, and in its place was something far more profound. "Connor," Siobhan said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Would you say something? Anything?" Connor looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding. He knew how much this meant to her, how long she had waited for this moment. He opened his mouth, and the words flowed as naturally as a stream coursing through a valley. "Mother," he began, his voice steady, though it still felt strange to hear. "I have never felt anything like this before. It is as if my heart has been opened." Siobhan gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, tears spilling from her eyes. Eamon, who had been standing by the window, turned sharply at the sound of his son's voice, his breath catching in his throat. He moved closer, his eyes wide with awe. Connor continued, his words coming slowly, deliberately, as if he were savoring the ability to speak. All these years, I thought I would never know what it was like to say what I felt, to give voice to my thoughts. But now, it's as though the words were always there, waiting for this moment. Siobhan sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the emotion of hearing her son's voice. She had prayed for this every day of his life, and now, here it was, more beautiful, more miraculous than she could have ever imagined. Eamon stepped forward, his voice rough with emotion. "Connor," he said, his eyes locked on his son's. "You sound like a man who has always known these words." Connor smiled gently, his eyes soft with the understanding that had always defined him. "Perhaps," he replied, "the words were waiting to be spoken. Perhaps they were always there, but it wasn't the right time." The days passed, and Connor's newfound voice continued to astound those around him. He spoke of things that surprised even himself. His thoughts on faith, on love, on the beauty of the world he had watched in silence for so long. His words carried a depth that seemed far beyond his years, and soon it became clear that his voice was not just a miracle for him, but a gift for all who heard him. The villagers, still buzzing with excitement from the miracle, began to gather outside the O'Rourke cottage, hoping to hear more from the boy whose silence had been replaced with such profound speech. At first, Connor was hesitant. He had spent so many years in silence, unsure of how to navigate this new world of words. But as he began to speak more freely, as he found his voice, not only in private but in public, something shifted within him. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the fields in a soft, golden light, a small group of villagers gathered outside the cottage, their faces filled with hope. Word had spread that Connor had begun to speak of things that moved people to tears, and now they came not just to witness a miracle, but to hear the wisdom of a boy whose voice had been touched by the divine. Connor stood by the door, his heart pounding as he looked out at the expectant faces before him. He felt a sense of responsibility he had never known before, a calling perhaps to share what had been given to him. He stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against his skin, and took a deep breath. "What would you have me say?" he asked, his voice strong yet gentle, carrying easily across the gathered crowd. An elderly woman stepped forward, her face lined with years of hardship, but her eyes bright with hope. "Connor," she said, her voice trembling, "you have been blessed. What do you make of this gift you've been given?" Connor paused, his mind turning over her words. He had thought about this often in the days since the miracle, what it meant, why it had happened. He knew, deep in his heart, that it wasn't just about him. His voice had been given for a reason, but that reason went far beyond his own life. "This voice," Connor began, his tone thoughtful, "is not just for me. I have been silent for so long, watching, listening, understanding the world in a way that others could not. But now, I believe my silence has given me something more, a way to see, to feel, to understand what others might miss." The villagers listened in rapt attention, their hearts swelling with emotion as Connor's words washed over them. "I have always believed in the power of faith," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "But now, I understand it in a way I never could before. God has given me this voice not for my sake, but for yours, for all of us. It is a reminder that He is always listening, always watching, even when we cannot hear Him. And when the time is right, He answers." A hush fell over the crowd, the weight of Connor's words settling over them like a warm blanket. For so long, they had seen him as the silent boy, the one whose prayers went unanswered. But now, standing before them, speaking with a voice filled with grace and wisdom, Connor was more than just a miracle. He was a testament to the power of faith. As the sun set and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, the villagers stayed long into the night, listening to Connor speak of things that moved their hearts in ways they hadn't felt in years. His voice, once thought lost, had become a beacon of hope, a reminder that sometimes the greatest miracles come not in the way we expect, but in the way we need. And as Connor spoke, his heart full of gratitude and wonder, He knew that this was only the beginning. His voice, once silent, would now be a source of light for all who listened. Part 5. A Voice That Moves the Mountains. A year had passed since the day Connor's voice had risen in the church courtyard, transforming the silent boy into a living testament to the power of faith. St. Michael's Church, once a humble gathering place for the people of Cork, had become a beacon, drawing visitors from all over Ireland, and even from far-off lands, to hear the story of the boy who spoke after a lifetime of silence. The stone walls of the church, worn by centuries of prayer, now seemed to radiate a new energy, one of hope, miracles, and divine presence. Inside, the pews were full, the congregation larger than ever. Families who had heard of Connor's story made pilgrimages to witness the miracle firsthand. Many came with their own burdens, seeking healing, guidance, or simply a reminder that God's grace was alive in the world. The village, once small and quiet, now buzzed with activity, its streets filled with travelers and worshipers. Connor, now 18, stood at the front of the church beside Father Patrick, his voice calm but commanding as he addressed the crowd. His once quiet presence had grown into something powerful. The boy who had spent his life in silence had become a man whose words carried the weight of wisdom far beyond his years. But despite all the attention, the accolades, and the awe he inspired, Connor remained humble, always remembering the quiet life he had once lived and the miracle that had changed everything. Faith, he spoke softly, but his voice reached every corner of the church, is not just about asking. It's about listening. It's about trusting that even in the silence, God is speaking to us. I spent my entire life without a voice, but now I know that my silence was not emptiness. It was preparation. The crowd hung on his every word. Some wept quietly. Others clasped their hands in prayer, moved by the sincerity of his speech. It wasn't just the miracle of Connor's voice that drew them in. It was the way his words seemed to cut through the noise of their lives, offering them a moment of clarity, a glimpse into something greater than themselves. Father Patrick watched from the side, his heart swelling with pride and reverence. He had seen Connor grow from a quiet boy into a young man who had embraced his role with grace and humility. The priest knew that what Connor had been given was not just a gift, but a responsibility, and Connor had embraced it fully. He spoke not for himself, but for those who needed to hear that God's love and power were still at work in the world. As the service came to a close, Connor stepped down from the altar, walking slowly through the church as people reached out to him, touching his arm, whispering prayers of their own. He smiled gently at each of them, offering a kind word or a blessing, his presence both calming and inspiring. He moved with a quiet confidence, aware that he was not the source of this miracle, but merely the vessel through which it had flowed. Outside the church, the air was crisp and cool, the skies clear and bright. The village was alive with the sounds of life. Children playing, vendors selling goods, visitors chatting excitedly about the day's sermon. It was a scene of joy, one that mirrored the sense of renewal that had taken root in the hearts of those who had come to witness the miracle. Connor walked through the village, his eyes taking in the familiar sights. He had grown up here, in these fields, on these cobblestone streets. And yet everything felt different now. Not because the village had changed, but because he had. He was no longer the boy who watched from the shadows, silent and unnoticed. He was a voice now, one that others listened to, one that others sought for comfort and guidance. And with that came a responsibility he carried with reverence. He paused at the edge of the village, overlooking the fields where he had often wandered in solitude. The wind brushed against his face, and for a moment he closed his eyes, feeling the familiar stillness that had once defined his life. In the quiet, he prayed, not for himself, but for all those who had come to him, for those who were still searching for their own miracles, for those who carried the weight of silence in their hearts. As he prayed, a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Father Patrick, who had followed him from the church, his steps slow and deliberate. "Connor," he said, his voice soft but full of affection, "you've come so far." Connor opened his eyes and smiled, the warmth of the priest's words settling over him like a gentle embrace. "I have, Father," he replied, "but there's still so much further to go." Father Patrick nodded, his eyes twinkling with a mix of pride and wisdom. "That's the truth of it, isn't it? The journey of faith never really ends." Connor turned back to the fields, the landscape stretching out before him like an endless expanse of possibilities. "I used to think," he began, "that the miracle I needed was my voice. But now, I realized that the real miracle was the journey. The silence wasn't a burden, it was a gift. It taught me how to listen, how to understand without words. And now, I see that my voice is only part of the miracle. The real miracle is what comes next, how I use it, who I speak for, what I say." Father Patrick smiled, his heart swelling with admiration for the young man before him. "You're right, Connor. The miracle isn't just what happened to you, it's what you do with it." Connor nodded, the weight of those words settling deep within him. He knew that his voice was a gift, but it was also a responsibility. And with that responsibility came the realization that his journey was just beginning. There were still so many who needed to hear his story, so many who needed to know that miracles were possible, that silence could be transformed into something beautiful, something powerful. Over the coming months, Connor's reputation grew. He was invited to speak at churches far beyond Cork, his voice becoming a source of inspiration for countless people. But no matter how far he traveled, how many people he spoke to, he always returned to St. Michael's, to the village that had been his home, to the place where his miracle had begun. And with each sermon, with each conversation, Connor's words carried the same message, that faith was not just about miracles, but about the quiet moments in between. It was in the waiting, in the listening, in the trust that even when nothing seemed to be happening, God was at work. One evening, after a particularly moving service, Connor stood outside St. Michael's, watching the sun set over the hills. The sky was ablaze with color, vibrant oranges and pinks blending into deep purples and blues. It reminded him of the day of the miracle, the way the light had filtered through the courtyard, the way the air had felt heavy with anticipation. As he stood there, a small girl approached him, her eyes wide with curiosity. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, her dark curls bouncing as she ran up to him. She tugged on his sleeve, her small voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Connor," she said, her eyes shining with innocence, "can you tell me what it's like to have a voice?" Connor knelt down to her level, his heart swelling with emotion at her simple question. He smiled gently, his eyes soft with understanding. "It's like a song," he said, his voice quiet but full of warmth. "A song that's been waiting inside you, waiting for the right moment to be sung. And when it finally comes out, it's the most beautiful thing you've ever heard." The girl smiled, her eyes lighting up as if she understood something far beyond her years. She hugged him quickly before running back to her family, her laughter ringing out in the cool evening air. Connor watched her go, his heart full. He had been given a voice, yes, but more than that, he had been given a purpose, a reason to speak, a reason to share the miracle that had changed his life. And as he watched the sun dip below the horizon, he knew that this was only the beginning. His journey of faith, of voice, of miracles was far from over. And in the quiet of that evening, with the wind whispering through the trees and the last rays of sunlight fading from the sky, Connor O'Rourke, the boy who had once lived in silence, stood tall, his voice now a light for the world. The silence had ended, and the voice of faith had begun. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.